I think I have the first item, refactor party starting in 14.1. How do we want to self-organize the question? A little bit of context before we open up for discussion. We are working on some UX iterations right now to think about any changes we might want to make to what we're coining collabject, which is the future like Epic issue requirement test case base view. And then we'd add some widgets and things on top of that to support each of the different types of issues. So that's happening. And then there's also refactoring Epic that we started to put together. The key outcomes I think that we're looking for is to migrate epics to an issue type hierarchy, and the single tech stack GraphQL Apollo wherever it makes sense, ideally everywhere. And then work towards more of an SBA architecture on the front end, as some of the work that Tim Zalman's done has already shown that that is a huge performance improvement when we do that. And then sort of the question is, are there other areas within our span of control outside of like the issue detail view and maybe some other places that we want to target for refactoring and add to our key outcomes as well? Because more or less as a product manager, I want to enable us to focus on paying down technical debt to increase our future velocity. So I think we've all been kind of bogged down by a lot of rapid actions and things like that. And I just want to like stop building new things and fix all the stuff we have where reasonable.
Is collabject a different object, or is it basically the issue with the issue types, all that stuff? We're just naming it collabject, or?
Yeah, we're doing that internally. So it was hard. Some of the designers were stuck on the idea of an epic or an issue in terms of thinking like it's the same thing under the hood. It will be the same thing. So we're just calling it a collabject, but what we call it technically in the API and things like that, it would be the issue and issue type hierarchy. We might call it something different in the UI. It's not ever going to be called collabject publicly, but it's like an internal code.
Might catch on, who knows? But yeah, I want to say collabject. Like I cannot think collabject.
So with that said, is there any, how do we want to approach self-organizing around this? Because I think ideally we would be ready to go in 14.1 so that we knew what we were doing and didn't spend much time like not knowing what we're doing.
Are these agenda items under how do we self-organize from the team, or are these just detail? And then
there are questions for the team opening up, because I have some perspective. Each engineer has other perspectives that's valuable. And I think what I would like to end up doing is getting to the point where we have a series of epics and issues grouped together that kind of represent getting to our key outcomes that we can track over time. And it can include other things that the engineers have flagged as important technical debt to pay down. Like it's not just the stuff that I've identified that will push the product vision forward. So I think that's where I wanted to form for us to all to self-organize and contribute towards like what we're going to be working on for several releases. So.
Well, it seems like getting epics to an issue type is a pretty well-defined thing. Like, so, you know, from what the product planning team can contribute, like that's definitely one thing. You asked about what other refactors would be important. Like it's becoming apparent to me that we've a pretty big, I don't know a better term than this, but blind spot for GraphQL. We don't have the granularity in GraphQL as regards observability that we do with our other media, so our REST APIs or web endpoints, where we can see like the amount of time that's spent in the database, the number of queries it made, the amount of reads and writes to Redis, all that kind of detailed information we can't get. And not only that, but because of the cardinality of basically like using Prometheus to measure so many different GraphQL queries and mutations, we can't actually even see requests per second relative to a particular query, which is a problem, right? So even the most standard stuff that we can get on our REST APIs, we can't currently get on GraphQL. So it's going to be, I'm not sure how we solve this, because you can't change the fact that, like, in order for me to know like how many times the create epic mutation is being called, like I can't do that basically in GraphQL, and that's a problem. So we'll need to solve that problem, I think, pretty soon, because at the minute we've zero visibility. I know from looking at the stage dashboard for Certified, there's very little in there, because all of the stuff we've built is pretty new and it all works off GraphQL.
We cannot do this in Prometheus and in these metrics, so we cannot build alerts. On the other side, if this should be just informative or for some investigation needs, we can get this data from Kibana, but I'm not sure if it matches the needs.
Yeah, we can. The weird thing about Kibana, I noticed, is that GraphQL requests are logged twice. They're logged once with very little information, and then they're logged again, but their query name isn't indexed in that instance, if that makes sense. So if you search by the query name, you get like very limited information, but you get a reliable chart. If you just filter by that query name, you get also a second request with all the data on time spent in the database and so on. Yeah, it's very strange. I think we need to kind of take a look at it.
Yeah.
Is this something we should step back and look at holistically? Because there's other teams using GraphQL as well. And I feel like we have a GraphQL first sort of mindset across GitLab. This doesn't seem like a problem that's going to go away. So do you know if there's other teams out there struggling with this as well, or are we sort of like the people in front and therefore we're hitting it first?
Yeah, no, we're not. I mean, we can only do it globally. We can only fix it globally. It would cost a lot more to fix it just for ourselves. But I think, like, as we start to think about things like scaling targets and so on, it becomes more, and our stage dashboards, and even like the process of getting SLIs in place for new features. Like, if they're built in GraphQL, it's incredibly hard to do. So maybe you're right. Maybe we're just hitting it first, or maybe we're not even hitting it first. Maybe other people are experiencing it as well. But it's just something we're going to have to solve.
I'd like to bring it up with the engineering allocation group too, that's been doing some of the work over there, because this sounds like something that is directly going to impact our measurability and observability from a scalability perspective. And that's sort of what the charter of that group was originally, with like Christopher Lefowitz and those, and Tim Zalman kind of, I mean, from what I've talked to them about in those stand-up meetings, they're all about trying to solve these long-term problems. But if we don't have observability or measurability as we move forward and create features, I think we're missing the fundamental step there. Because if we're trying as a company to become more data-driven and look at scaling opportunities, this is going to pose a significant risk to us, more so than any of the tech debt out there. Because it's like an unknown unknown. We don't even know what things are doing. So those are like the ones you never want, are the unknown unknowns. Having an unknown with a fixed set is fine, because then you can go and solve it. Or having a fixed set with an unknown scope is fine, because then you can get the scope. But the unknown unknown is really difficult.
Yeah, I don't want to derail any more of the discussion into like scalability, but there is a project called Tamland, which gives us an overall view and lets us forecast forward like 2 or 3 months. So you can look globally at pressure on the database. You can look globally at read-write on Redis clusters and other like non-horizontally scalable resources, but it is global. And you might be able to say, okay, we'll use Kibana to figure out what our like really expensive actions are. But the more stuff we move into GraphQL, the harder it is to get that information. And so if we're actually successful in being GraphQL first and moving more and more things into GraphQL, if we don't solve this problem, we're actually removing stuff from what's observable, like removing information from the sphere of what's observable.
Yeah, I would say that I didn't realize we were in that early stage of observability, but if that's the case, I think that's one of the most important things to solve. And I guess the question is, do we know how we want to solve the problem? Which is the first thing. Like, you know, there's the taking the time to do it, but do we even know how to solve it? And then second, like I would look at, are there open source tools available for monitoring that work well with GraphQL? Is also worth like exploring paying for external tools like the observability suite from Apollo GraphQL, the company. I guess that's the first step is identifying how we want to solve it.
Yeah, I don't have an answer really at the minute. We're working on our stage group sort of scalability dashboards, if you like, with Sean from Scalability. And we're just focusing on REST endpoints, Git, and Sidekick workers. And then presumably like we'll address GraphQL later.
So I think the question is, like on the engineering side, we know the importance of observability. It's really now about prioritizing this, like the research work, which we should think about how we want to handle. This is something that it's not like there's not a requirement to finish the issue redesign before we start working on this. So I'm wondering if we can say as a team that this is something we want to commit to prioritizing, start doing some of the investigation now in 13.12 or 14.0. Like, are we okay as a team in prioritizing this work? It's more of a question for product.
I have not moved. I'm basically not. I said that basically again. I'm not going to put anything new into the 14.0 issue that wasn't in the 13.12 planning issue, except for security or performance things that were new that are deadly or bad. So I pretty much have signaled to my leadership that we are feature frozen indefinitely. We'll see how long that I can hold that up without getting like a ton of pushback. But right now, because of everything else that's going on, it's a great time to be able to do that. So if this is the thing that we need to do, and this is like the dependency before we can move to GraphQL first safely, then yes, I'm totally great with it. I can't speak for Kristen and Mark. They have their own things. So.
I'm also
I
okay
don't
with
disagree with that.
pausing. Yeah, like I've been saying, also communicating that up. And so there's a window of time now. I just pushed some of our category maturity back about 6 months. We've got some space to be able to get this right. And I will
I mean, I'm in the same
prioritize
boat.
security as well, but.
Yeah, I agree with what Gabe and Kristen are saying. I mean, I know we're in the middle of trying to convert issues or requirements over to issue types, and I know that work is ongoing. But aside from that, of course, the things that are already sort of in flight, I am fine with sort of just stepping back and understanding what we need to do holistically so that we can move forward faster. Because I think if we solve these underlying problems, we're going to be much quicker in the future. That's just my thought, though.
Cool. Okay. I think I have the next part. So as we're building out some of the other things that we're using GraphQL for, like filtered search and list view, we are finding some things that we had assumed we got to when we were refactoring some of the other parts of the application that were in GraphQL, but that aren't quite done yet. So my question is, how do we want to handle building out the GraphQL API? Like, do we want to sit down and figure out what we need from it before the refactor and maybe start working on those before 14.1? Or do we want to build out as we're get more alignment between the front end and the back end and build out as we're building out features for the refactor in 14.1 beyond. Gabe, you have a good point there.
I don't have a preference other than I would encourage us to think in terms of data graphs and not REST endpoints. Like that's part of the whole value of GraphQL is it enables you to more richly express what you want to query without having to like get a list of IDs that make a request for each ID to get the like actual resource. So that's my only feedback because I've seen us like there's varying levels of experience with GraphQL. I'm still learning myself. And so I think that's where like understanding the core principles, but in what order we do it, I don't really mind. I've also seen a lot of value in letting front end heavily influence the shape of the schema, if that makes sense. But I totally trust engineering to pick however you want to do it.
Yeah, I'd love for us to be more schema first, because that'll also somewhat help out with our multi-version deployment issues. If we can like define a schema first and get that just even with null values, get that merged in it. We don't have as many error. We have less chance of having errors on the front end that just stop us from getting any data in the GraphQL API. Yeah, you want to talk as you type?
Yeah, just a generic thought that if we would know rather sooner than later what will be front-end needs from GraphQL API, it might be better to make sure that we don't hit some roadblock. For example, I know that there is now a problem with uploads through GraphQL. So it might be better to have at least a better idea what are needed endpoints for this refactoring. So we will be also able to better schedule this work to make sure that frontend is not blocked when you have capacity to work on it.
Yeah, so if that's the case, then we're kind of, for the most part, probably going to have to wait until 14.1 because we don't know. Like the idea isn't to be at feature parity with a refactor from legacy issue page, right? Gabe and Kristen and Mark. So there may be some things that that we require from GraphQL that we don't know until the redesign is complete.
I think that part of the feature freeze is there might be some mutations, but the shape is sort of according with the refactor. We don't want to change, we don't want to add any new features. And we don't want to change the data graph, right? So that's like one of the things that we put on ourselves is like, we're going to keep everything we have now. We just are going to present it in a different way. So that may change how we query things, but I don't see why it necessarily would. That's just all I know right now. Could change.
Parenting may be a little more robust though within issues.
That's a good point.
But yeah, parenting might be the, because you could have parents happening between different objects, different issue types, and deeper than it is currently.
Yep, that would be the key thing that would change a little bit, especially because we basically want to have the same sort of parenting support test sessions and test cases, what is now epics and issues and all that other stuff, and then even requirements, being able to support multi-level requirements. So it should be fairly generic to work across just an issue type hierarchy, but that doesn't exist right now at all. So
okay, so the things we
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say the things that we are requiring that are the same as what we have for legacy issue, like relationship management. Should we add that? And I did add it as a key outcome, but should that be an outcome saying that we want that stuff to remain the same? Or no?
The relationships is an interesting thing. That's like this first UX iteration, we're working on sort of like the description and discussions and stuff like that. And then the next one, we're going to be working on metadata. And then the third iteration, we're working on relationships. But like this is basically like my current thinking. And I think we would have to, put it under whatever that is there, components. But more or less, there's lots of different relationships that need to be present. And I'll share my screen real quick. We don't know how the UI is going to work for this, but there's more or less like all of these different things that people want to relate to issues, similar to what's happening with merge requests, vulnerabilities. We want linked issues like related merge requests, epics and issues, or like the parent type stuff, related incidents. Requirements are going to need to be related to issues, more or less, and vulnerabilities. And so eventually it will look something sort of like this, where you have these, everything in blue is sort of an issue type, right? And then this, I guess an incident is too, but they get organized into some sort of like work item tree. And then there is like a related, so we're keeping the related thing. We're keeping the blocking relationships, and that's not changed. I think the thing that we're sort of introducing in a little bit more generic way is taking what we have now with the epic, which is the parent-child relationship, and making that kind of work with like in an issue type hierarchy, if that makes sense. So I don't know how that's going to impact UX necessarily, but I see that as something that has to be solved in order to migrate epics to issue type hierarchy.
I'll just jump in there too. From yesterday, I think, and I hope Alexis doesn't mind that I'm quickly just looking at this. We didn't look at it in our meeting, but the one part, like Gabe was mentioning, the relationship, this part, the fact that there's children objects within an epic, that's the messiest thing and the most heavyweight thing in the UI. And that's probably because we're not tackling that to the third design sprint. We're not really thinking about it until then. I think that's the one that could inform engineering the most, kind of like on this shift. So once that happens, once we start ideating and figuring out how it would all go together, I think it will bring a little more clarity around what we need to support. But I think from a constraint standpoint, it's going to be looking at what are my children and really focusing on the objects below me in the tree initially, versus showing the whole way up the chain as well, which gets a lot more complicated.
It seems also that we have two types of relationships, the object relationships and also the types themselves relationships, which is slightly confusing, I think. On the screen that you shared, Gabe, it was under the types heading, and it was talking about child-parent relationship and also blocking, non-blocking relationship. Is that on types? Can types, like, can we have a type that is blocking another type, or is it object actually relationships? Like, do we have an issue where we can discuss that in more detail? What does that types versus types relationship mean, and how we want to design those, and what is the scope of the type? Do we define it only at the type level group, any level group, project, and so on and so forth?
I would use that issue that I linked and start asking all those questions there. And those are things that we can collaborate on as we like move in. We can even move the relationships up in iteration and do that next, Kristen and Mark, if we want to do that. So that way we can explore it after we do like this base discussion piece, because it would be natural. But the way that I sort of am thinking about it now, at least, is like a parent-child is within like one sort of work tree, but you can have multiple parents. So like that's the whole like value of multi-tree relationships, where there's this like interesting open source app that or project that is tackling that pretty well, and I'll link to that. But yeah, let's start the discussion async so we can get all of the questions out there, and that would be great to have engineering leads on that too, because more or less we want to support multiple parents on things, which is going to be UX challenge in and of itself. But we want it to be performant. And so I think that's where thinking about what constraints we need to introduce would be helpful.
And that is multiple parents at both types and objects, or?
Well, currently, like, I think there's two concepts here. One would be the templated way that the hierarchy sets up. So you could have an epic above an issue and maybe a requirement below an issue. So there's a hierarchy in terms of the objects that we'll use in the UI, or we may allow the user to set that up. There's actually another type, which is just like the loose object relation. Like this is related to these other objects, but it doesn't necessarily like it's not a parent, and it doesn't end up showing up on roadmaps, but it's got more of a loose level relation to another thing. And I think that could go to any related types. But I think initially we're going to set up the structure where we're parenting on a specific tree, like epics to issues. We know that that's currently how GitLab works. And if issues or epics can have multiple levels up to 6. So yeah, we do have to have some more discussion around those and just naming them. It's a good call. Later in the,
It sounds more like the types would be some sort of a validation thing where you cannot relate, cannot have an issue be a parent of an epic or something like that. So like when you display relationships or something like that, when you want to add an epic to an issue, you basically always add that as some sort of a parent or whatever sort of relationships you do define between the types. And then the objects should follow those relationships, but also can have some other things. Yes. So yeah, there is something to be discussed, and to at least for me to understand how that's going to work out.
Yeah, from a trade. Sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
I just pasted in that I need to rearrange my epics into this hierarchy. This is from our design sprints in terms of our scope, but 1B, that's what I was saying, like arranging them into the hierarchy, and then also creating the parent-child relationships between the individual objects that each have an ID.
Yeah, and I think that I put this together because from several customer conversations I've been a part of, especially those ones that use requirements and test cases and all those things together in terms of traceability, this is sort of what they end up with from some form or fashion. They're able to tie a test case to a parent test session. Test case gets also tied to a requirement. A requirement gets tied to a user story that implements the requirement, right? The user story is part of a bigger feature. That bigger feature might map to a higher level requirement. Somewhere in there you have MRs that get like actually do the implementation that you want to have tied back into like your requirement and the user story that implements it. At some point you might have an incident that triggers a bug that's part of this feature, that's part of this requirement that eventually might go back to this test case, right? And so I think it's where I don't know how we're going to solve for it, but that's the level of traceability that our customers want in terms of relationships. And I think figuring out how to do that in a consistent, predictable way from both like engineering and UX is definitely going to be a challenge. So,
hey, Gabe, can you post a link to that? Because I want to switch those requirements things around. And L1 is your top level requirement. Your L3 is your design. So I just want to flip them so it's to clarify for the
any I got
external
that wrong.
users.
It's under A2A 3 2 4 yeah. I'll just highlight it yellow.
I just made a note as well at the end that we should have an engineer cadence of meetings. Engineering, just like we're doing with design, so we can start having these conversations more frequently leading up to the 6-week mark. And also the engineers can attend the convergence meetings if they want with design, or you can watch the recorded videos. I suggest everyone at least watch the recordings so that everyone's up to speed and we're not necessarily moving all of, like I just moved a big chunk of content in from our design sprint meetings, but we'd like everyone to kind of just be aware because it's going to be such a critical point of time for how we build this architecture up underneath.
Yeah, and your points seem pretty important there, actually, like before you moved it. Like you were saying that the work for parent-child's relationships on epics is blocked by the group and project consolidation.
Yeah, I realized I probably put it on the wrong place in the document, but yeah, my question is, are we focusing on parent-child component because of epics specifically? Because epics are blocked by project group consolidation work, which is definitely not a short-term work. So I don't see us to convert epics into issue type in short-term time. So if this would be the major reason for working on this, we might perhaps deprioritize this in favor of something else.
So I had an update down below, I think on the point C, that we had a meeting to kick off the workspaces and emerging groups and projects. It's going to start moving forward. It's got, I think, a DRI engineer from Access now, or they're looking for one, and they're going to take the lead. But the first thing that they're going to be working on, in addition to the like architecture blueprint, is getting issues at the group first. So I'm sure at some point we're going to need to contribute to doing that. But once we have issues at the group level, then it sort of, I think, unblocks all of this stuff, like specifically migrating epics to issue types, having consistent like planning or a collab check on the group and the project level, and then allowing multi-level requirements, multi-level test sessions like at the group level. So there's two things, I guess, two ways that we can approach this. One, we can build this out like at the project level and work on the hierarchy and the relationships between types of issues at the project level, because theoretically, once we do that and we are at the group level, however we end up solving it without duplication, I guess that's where we just need to figure out, like, are we going to do the shadow thing, or are we going to do like the containable, right? But hopefully we'll have some clarity within the next 4 to 6 weeks on how we're going to tackle that, because there are people that are supposed to be working on it now. So I don't know if that helps.
Well, thanks for updates. We can discuss this further asynchronously, because it's news to me that we are going to prioritize issues on group level, because it seems like to some extent it will not be needed work once we consolidate projects and groups together, right? Because if we would prioritize projects and groups consolidation, we wouldn't have to implement issues on group level.
Yeah, I think
we can discuss.
You're right, though, and I think it is important, and I think we need to make sure that whatever we do works and gels well with that, right? Whether it's us focusing on getting that forward first, or having some engineers from our stage contribute to that while we also move some of this and like connect the work streams together in the future. But that's a huge thing, and it's good that you call it out, and I thank you for that.
Yeah, we might figure out that it makes more sense to implement epics, new epics on issue types at the group level, which would not be doubling the work. But the team could figure out what's the first step or what's the most important one. I'm super lost in the agenda.
Yeah, me too. I think we're, I mean, we should move on probably to some of the other stuff. Yeah, so we have time to talk through some of the issue specific discussion and demos too, unless, yeah, KB did read only. Kristen, I think your point B can probably be read only too. So yeah, let's move on to, if that's okay with you.
I have one question for the team for B. Oh, wait, are we which one are we talking about? In issue specific?
Yeah, let's go B.
4B?
Oh, wait. Is that what you're talking about? Issue specific?
Yes.
Okay, let's go with Jan A first then.
Yeah.
Okay. So today I was just reviewing some nice performance optimization, which is related to caching issue counts in the issues list on group level. I have some concerns about caching discounts. My major concern is that it's quite, I suspect that discounts, if we cache them across all users, will be typically or most of the time outdated or not accurate. So I was curious, what are others' thoughts about caching counts in the list, on the list page, on group issues page? Or if we could figure out some other approach, because as a user, I would rather I would rather not have counts at all if these are misleading, rather than have some counts which are not accurate. This might be also UX related, because it's question whether it's okay to show inaccurate, because I think that there is then no other place where a user can actually find exact or correct number of issues if we don't show accurate number on displays, because we already cache numbers in the left panel. So
Yeah,
I wonder.
I like, for me personally, I think I would not want them cached or rounded, so to say, on the issue list page if there is any kind of filtering. So if I filter down by a label, author, or anything, I would really want to see more of an exact number. But then when I see, like, even if I go to GitLab org to the list page and I see 50,000 issues or something like that, that's not as important. As you said, we can even skip that number for all of the issue count, like, in my opinion. But when I do filter down to something, I want to see that there are 5 issues or 10 or 1,000 issues that match my search criteria or something like that.
I should
That's
also
what I
point out
was
that now caching is done only for listing without filters. Yeah, so without
Okay.
filters, caching is used, but with any filters applied, caching is not
So
used.
I'm not sure if that helps with the performance problem, or we want the caching for filters as well, just like to fix this thing. About, like, from an UX perspective, I would think that when you do apply some filtering, you'd want to see some sort of a feedback, what, like, how many issues you have there, or how many things you found by filtering down.
Yeah, I wonder if filters would be used for smaller projects than GitLab org, because then it's quite common that on my personal projects, I don't use any filters because of the small number, but the counts would not match there and either. So maybe we could cache from some threshold, like 1,000 or something.
Yeah, like what we do right now for the sidebar, right?
Well, I also dropped in a link to some things that I was playing around with in my non-engineering self. But right now we get all of the issues across all states, open, closed, and then to show the counts for each. And I was curious, like, if there are things, if we were to change the UX where we show just the count of open when you're on the open tab, and then if you clicked on close, you'll see the count of close. So we're not querying counts for all. Basically, it would be like right now, how many issues are closed? A lot more than are open. So that's one thing that we could do, where we still show the number on the active tab, or if, like, all when you click on it. The other that I was playing around with is, can we simplify the query a little bit, and thinking about if we don't filter by issue type and we just show all types of issues initially on the initial load, and then we basically only show things that are open. The query was really fast when I was playing around with it in the database lab. So that could be another thing to look at too, is like simplifying the UI and removing counts where we don't really need to count because we're not in that current context, and or simplifying the query a little bit. But
I agree. I think there's a certain point when the number is so large that it's no longer meaningful, and maybe seeing that breakdown would be more useful.
Cool. Yeah. Holly, if you would have a minute, would you mind to please give a feedback to the issue or to the merge request? What are your thoughts about this from UX point of view? Cool. Thank you very much.
Of course, happy to do it.
Yeah, and what are the circumstances by which the count would be inaccurate? I know we took into account we bust the cache when common actions are taken, so I'm assuming that like uncommon actions might cause it to be inaccurate for a while, like large imports or like moving.
So
issues.
currently there are quite a bunch of situations. I listed these I know about in the comment I linked from the document, but it would be any time when basically two different users access this page and both of them have different permissions in subgroups. Yeah, they would see inaccurate numbers. Whenever you close an issue, you would see inaccurate number 2 for the next 1 hour or until the cached count expires. Also, when you move any issues around, so yeah, I suspect that on frequently used projects like GitLab work, I think that this number would be inaccurate for quite frequently because of the high traffic on issue states.
And that's just the ones you know about, right? Like,
yeah,
so,
there would be much more, of course.
the one thing I would say about that is though that, like I mentioned in the doc, like there are a couple of facts about this. One is that these counts are really expensive relative to their utility, in my opinion. The second of all is I believe we only cache north of 1,000 issues, and the question again is, for me, is it useful? I mean, if I close an issue in a project with 33,484 open issues, do I mind that that number is inaccurate for an hour afterwards? Like, maybe not. But then if that's the case, why do we even do the count in the first place? Why not just say more than 1,000 issues? And then if you like make the count async or something.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Personally, maybe it would be ideal to have just a raw number estimated around it, but it would be cool if user could still on demand ask for accurate count if needed, which might be handy for some filtering of issues which matches some conditions, but yeah, I don't know.
Or importing issues, like you do want to know that all of your issues that you wanted to be imported are imported. Right? So if you're importing 100,000 issues, you do want to know that all the 100,000 got there.
That's pretty good scenario, right?
Okay, I have the next. I think I've mentioned this on a few other calls, but I wanted to just thank the team for everyone contributing and getting their tracking up. I linked to our Gmail dashboard. We do have, if I look here, I'm just going to share my screen. Underneath project planning, if you scroll down, there are actions. We now have WIP Gmail users interacting with epics, and the data is coming through for nearly all of the trackers. So thank you everyone for that. That's going to contribute huge to our MAU numbers. There were a few items in there I couldn't find that are in the main issue. I'm off the issues now. but I can work with the team. There's just a couple discrepancies. And then a question I have is the next thing that I'd like to do is to have the exact same stats for event track counting versus the unique users. And so is it the right way to do it? Or if I just dupe the current issue and make another table and have a column on the end just to count the individual events versus deduping it down to users? And just to be clear too, so everyone understands that currently we can see how many people are like adding epics, but if I had 1,000 epics today, I'm going to only be tracked as one because I'm one unique user. So I want to see the relative usage of each of our features by just converting or adding another event count to each of these different ones.
It's deduped. Interesting. So if we have 7,500 today, that could actually be much higher. Like 7,500 epics created or reported as created today could actually be much higher because everyone just counts as one, right?
Yeah, anything that has MAU in it just counts as one user, the way it works. And so then we would need an actual action count that wouldn't be deduped to be able to see the relative feature usage of our features.
Got it. Thanks.
I'm assuming it'll just be another Redis counter that would just increment on each of the actions, but whatever the team suggests to get those in there and get them all into the database, to the tracking dictionary.
Yeah, it's just a normal Redis counter. I don't think it's a Redis HLL counter. So I think they have just the increment method in that. Here's the docs.
Okay, I'll make an issue for that. Thank you. John, did you want to voice yours over?
Yeah, I think we're at time, but I figured with 3 people on the call who might know, is forecasting enabled on CSense globally? Because I'd really like to use it for scaling targets, but I can't find if it's just disabled for me or disabled globally. Do you know?
I don't know. I think they make them specific for they make an algorithm in our MAU calculations.
Yeah, let me find a handbook.
Interesting, because they built in some, they say it's AI-based forecasting, but I think it really just picks the most likely forecast from a set of probably polynomial, exponential, different algorithms, right? I have the page for it here.
Let me find you an example chart that I was looking at the other day where PM did all of this in CSense, which you maybe can take from and use.
That'd be great. Thanks. You can do it, I think. It's no big deal.
Okay.
Thanks.
Cool. Well, we are at time. Good conversations, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Bye.